Hello and welcome to this today's webinar session number 304. Today we're going to be discussing about preventing and preempting pandemics. The world is experiencing an unprecedented rise in emerging and re-emerging zoonotic diseases. In the last 20 years, over 12 new high-consequence viral zoonotic diseases have emerged. All of these have jumped from wild animals to humans and their livestock. The most notable ones, of course, are those like SARS, various avian influenza A viruses, Ebola, Zika, and ongoing COVID-19. Collectively, they've caused enormous local, regional, and global impacts. While scientists have been predicting and warning the global community of the threats of pandemics, it is clear that the world is not really prepared to tackle such an emergency. COVID-19 is the most devastating pandemic since the influenza pandemic of 1918. And it has shown clearly that pandemics and other high impact emerging diseases can emerge anytime, any place, and with unpredictable results. COVID-19 further highlights the inability of the global community to forecast the emergence of new zoonoses and to prevent and respond efficiently to ever the crippling health and socioeconomic impacts of the disease. It is also increasingly becoming obvious that the more innovative technological solutions are urgently needed to better be prepared for the next pandemic and also to halt these repeated cycles of pandemics. So, welcome to this PMARC webinar on preventing, detecting, responding to, and recovering from future threats. My name is Subhash Mazaria, and I'll be your moderator today. Today, I have 4 speakers who will discuss how innovations can help build on the existing systems towards early detection, response to pandemic disease threats, leading to more effective risk mitigation strategies. Our first speaker today will be Dennis Carroll, Dr. Dennis Carroll, who is a chair, leadership board of Global Virome Project. He will tell us why viral discovery in wildlife is an important key to early detection and response. Dr. Carroll will be followed by Dr. Christine Jonsson. She's the director of Epicenter for Disease Dynamics, University of California. And she'll be talking about how refining hotspot maps or hotspots can enable forecasting and targeting surveillance and response. I will follow Dr. Johnson, and I will be talking about what is required for global viral surveillance network. And our webinar session will end with Dr. Benjamin Oppenheim, who is a vice president of product policy and partnerships of a private enterprise called Metabiota. He'll be talking about financing a global viral surveillance network, discussing about benefit and cost analysis. So we're going to start very soon, but just before I invite Dr. Carroll, I'd just like to remind you that there will be a question and answer session at the end of all 4 presentations. And please feel free to send your questions to a Q&A box, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen, and we will address them as appropriately through various panelists. So thank you very much, and welcome, Dr. Dennis Carroll.
Subhash, thank you for the introduction. Let me first off welcome everyone to this session. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you may be. And a special thanks to our colleagues from the Prince Maudol Awards Conference and the Secretariat for their continued excellence in organizing and preparing these events. Greatly appreciated. What I would like to do is move to, and what I would like to talk about is, as Subhash mentioned, we're in the midst of clearly an historic global event. And As we struggle with COVID-19 and all of its both health, social, and economic consequences, we also have to remind ourselves that COVID-19 is not the first pandemic or global epidemic that we've been challenged with in our lifetimes, and it is not the last. That even as we struggle with COVID-19, we have to prepare ourselves for what will be the inevitable next event. And we will be talking in this session about why a global viral surveillance network is critical for ensuring that we never again are confronted with the historic events of a COVID-19 pandemic ever again. First and foremost, COVID-19 has dramatically illustrated that the world is not prepared for events of this kind. For 1 year ago, in December, in China, was the first indications of a novel respiratory virus. Here we are 11 months after that particular event, and the world at large is struggling with repeated cycles of shutdowns, economic, social events that are catastrophic, not just in terms of our societies, but our economies. And we've seen the virus continue to take a huge toll in human life. It's clear that the world is not prepared to deal with these events, even as we are now preparing for the possibilities of multiple vaccines to move forward in our response. 12 months after the emergence of this virus, that is not quick enough. And as we think about the future challenges, we need to be asking ourselves, how can we do better? How can we make sure that we simply are not as victimized by future events as we are by today's event? Our core strategy for dealing with events like COVID-19 historically has been one of reacting, waiting for the earliest signals of an index case, the earliest moment when we recognize there is a novel virus circulating among a population. For us, that signal occurred in Wuhan, China in December of 2019. But by then, the virus had already established itself as a significant agent for community spread. And it's clear that we have not been able to mobilize an early enough response to be able to isolate and eliminate this virus at its point of origin. And that really goes to the failed strategy of reacting. What we need to be thinking about as we prepare for future threats, that we need to be thinking about how to be proactive. One key take-home lesson about the COVID-19 pandemic is that even as we first recognized its emergence in December of 2019, the virus that is causing this pandemic already pre-existed long before, circulating in wildlife animal populations in China and possibly elsewhere. And what we need to appreciate is that we have an opportunity to not simply wait for the virus to spill over into us and then try and respond. We need to exploit our understanding that these viruses already pre-exist in nature, are already circulating in wildlife around the world. And we have the opportunity to take our ability to go to the virus before they come to us, to build a surveillance system that exploits our understanding of the animal-human ecosystem interactions that enable new viral threats to emerge. Exploit that understanding to build a surveillance capability that allows us to begin thinking proactively about how we can use this information about where spillover is greatest, we understand that not only is a virus circulating in wildlife today, but that there are high-risk animal hosts that have the potential for high interaction with human populations in areas where people and wildlife and livestock are interacting in ways that enable spillover. We have the opportunity to take this knowledge, not just about pre-existence of viruses in wildlife, but geographic areas that are known to be hotspots for spillover, where the interactive dynamics between animal hosts and people enable spillover events to occur, and use that information to strategically target those high-risk animals and human populations in geographic hotspots for enhanced surveillance. We can identify and characterize and monitor these events before they emerge as true global health challenges. We have the opportunity to have a surveillance strategy that doesn't simply focus on identifying early the index case of a new emergent threat. We have the opportunity to look beyond the human population and target those places, those animal species, and those human populations that really speak to high risk. We have the opportunity to exploit this in such a way that it allows us to think about targeting those human behaviors and practices in these geographic hotspots where spillovers are most likely to occur, to be able to build a system for early detection, but most importantly, a system for prevention. Spillovers are a direct consequence of the way we as a species interact with the animal and ecosystems around us. And understanding what those behaviors and practices are that enable a virus circulating in a wildlife animal population to spill over into us. It may be a practice that involves live animal markets. It may be a practice that involves mining in caves that are rich with bat populations. We have the opportunity to be thinking strategically about where these human behaviors and practices are putting us at risk and using that information to target preemptive measures to prevent the spillover in the future, better manage the animal-human interactions in animal markets, better manage the way we make our incursions into wildlife areas, whether it is for mining or petroleum or for expanded agricultural practices. Those risks are predictable and risk mitigations are possible. Ultimately, we have the opportunity to not simply develop individual systems for early surveillance. We have the opportunity to build a global network that's monitoring the genetic and ecologic evolution of high-risk viruses. Our ability to identify viruses circulating in wildlife animals today, identify which of those viruses, based on certain genetic and ecologic features that speak to elevated risk, that these viruses, among all others, are ones that we should be monitoring and tracking. We should be watching their genetic evolution, watching their ecologic evolution, their host range, their interactive dynamics between people and animal populations, and the opportunity to use this information of building a global atlas that speaks to the distribution of high-risk viruses around the world, geographically where they are, understanding comprehensively what their animal reservoirs are, understanding those animal reservoirs and their interactive dynamics with people, and using that to build a hotspot map, a high-risk profiling of where these potential spillover events might occur, and use that big data to begin to transform our understanding about where risks of future spillover might occur, to forecast the emergence of future threats, to use this information then to target preventive measures for their emergence, to disrupt the potential for spillover, and to have a surveillance system that does have the ability, by monitoring wildlife, livestock, and people in these hotspot areas, to have early signatures when there is a spillover event, so that we can pick this up before the virus has a chance to establish itself in a human population for rapid isolation and elimination. And finally, to exploit the big data on having genetic profiles of not simply individual viruses such as COVID-19 or SARS or MERS, 3 examples of coronaviruses, but to have detailed genetic profiles of the entire genetic range of 4,000 different coronaviruses that we know are currently circulating in wildlife, and use that big data to transform how we think about future biomedical countermeasures, not vaccines for individual viruses, but using that broad genetic profiling to begin developing vaccine strategies for viral families, to think about new opportunities to exploit gene editing to further protect us against future threats, to expand our diagnostic capabilities, to look at broad spectrum diagnostics, ultimately to build a toolbox that should a future threat emerge and spread, we have the opportunity to protect the world's population so that we never again have the kind of COVID-19 experience that we are experiencing today. Fundamentally, however, it requires we change the paradigm of how we prepare for future threats. We need to stop reacting. We need to build a global culture and make a global investment in a viral surveillance network that enables us to predict, enables us to prevent, enables us to identify, and it enables us to isolate and eliminate any and all future threats. We live in a world where the 21st century speaks to the continued expansion and increase of not just pandemics of the COVID-19 type we are experiencing today, but global epidemics where new epidemic viruses that may have been localized events in the past because of global travel, as we saw with the Ebola epidemic in West Africa in 2014, creates a risk of global epidemics. We need to transform how we prepare, how we think, how we act, and ultimately a core component of that transformative power is with a global viral surveillance network. With that, I thank you, and I will turn over to Dr. Christine for her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the Secretariat and the Prince Mahidol Awards Conference, the conference organizers, and my fellow panelists. It is really an honor to be here with you all. So we have been asked to discuss a forward-leaning virus surveillance strategy based on looking back across all that we have learned. So I hope to share my perspective on all of that and all that we know and all that we don't know, and how best we can move forward in the current situation that we find ourselves in. So as has been already said a couple times, emergence of new viruses is happening at a rate that is faster than ever. We know this is a result of many highly interconnected processes that are occurring across the landscape, often involving wildlife, or almost always involving wildlife, oftentimes involving domesticated species, and people, and always in the face of environmental change. And this starts with the evolution of mutation-prone RNA viruses to Typically, we see transmission between multiple animal species before we see spillover into people. And then given globalized travel, human-to-human transmission quickly can occur, setting off a pandemic in those cases. And human coronaviruses are somewhat new on the scene to many, but have been around for a while, actually. There are now 7 recognized human coronaviruses. It would not surprise us if there are more out there, actually, that just haven't been discovered. The majority of these, I've put the date here that they were first detected or first discovered. The majority were discovered within the last 20 years, which is pretty surprising. And we think that there are animal origins for all of these, with domesticated species recognized in some that played an important, crucial role in spillover into human populations. And there's human-to-human transmission that occurs globally, and these viruses are endemic, some of them, and some of them have caused pretty severe outbreaks in the past. And there are many questions about the species that are involved, including several of the coronaviruses, and especially the most recent one. These question marks that I have here highlight that we only really know part of the story still. And what we expect is that this is the more likely scenario for zoonotic viruses in general. We typically only detect the tip of the iceberg of the most clinically significant cases in people. Most often in urban settings where there's ready access to healthcare and excellent diagnostics, as we saw with the outbreak of SARS-CoV-2 in Wuhan. But we understand that there's really much broader circulation, much more than is realized. And work that we've done really highlights that there's epidemics occurring, certainly in animal populations with cross-species transmission that set off a big epidemic, but that there's also probably been spillover events prior in time before they've even been recognized, perhaps in more rural settings where there weren't adequate diagnostics. And our work has really suggested that spillover of zoonotic viruses from wild animals to people is far more common than we realize, and that spillover events are really an expected consequence of interactions between people and animals, especially given trajectories in environmental change. And this is really, this space here, this is really where we need to be for surveillance of future threats, rather than here at the very tip of the iceberg once cases are recognized. So shifting that paradigm to the left, as we like to say. So we're in a new era of pandemics because of accelerated global change, and it has everything to do with agricultural development, industrialization, urbanization, globalization, and movement of people and animals on the international scale, much of which has brought about substantial gains in human well-being and economic development, but in many ways been at the cost of degradation of ecosystem services. And when we have degradation of the environment, we worry about these nonlinear abrupt changes in ecological processes and a diminished capacity for regulatory processes in the environment. And we can think about disease outbreaks and disease regulation as an ecosystem service. And the consequence of disrupting that service is increasingly frequent emerging infectious diseases, as we've seen. And there's been major changes to the landscape, which rather shocking levels actually of habitat loss and habitat fragmentation. And this is work done by IPIVIS, which is an international group that's put out some amazing reports and policy around environmental change. I just really want to highlight here the huge changes and shifts on every continent, really, as well as the substantial loss in wild species. So loss of species richness is actual loss of wildlife species, again, on every single continent. And these changes to the landscape have direct implications for emerging infectious disease. We can think of the risk of emergence, of virus emergence as being highest here, sort of at the ecosystem edge, where we see this landscape change in these transitional zones and fragmented habitats, where wildlife are adapting to changes in their landscape, and there's a mix of species, including some very adaptable species, especially species that are adept at accommodating or even thriving in human-modified habitat and human-modified landscape, and thus have increased opportunities for contact with people and domesticated species. So this is a network just showing the amazing connectivity of all zoonotic viruses recognized to date. So all of these viruses are these little dots here, and they're all connected based on the species that are shared. And we should not be at all surprised that domesticated species like pigs, cattle, and horses are the most, have actually had, they're the species with the most zoonotic viruses detected to date. That's true, obviously, given centuries of domestication and the close relationship that we have with these animals. But these domesticated species have played a really fundamental role in emergence of disease to humans. So all of these viruses are shared with humans, and these domesticated species in the center of the network here are highly connected, really connecting many parts of the network that would never have been connected to humans otherwise. And the role of livestock makes perfect sense when you think of their enormous ecological footprint. Here I show the global abundance of different livestock species. And statistically, this is highly correlated with the number of zoonotic viruses that these species carry that they have shared with people along the way. And this is especially evident the way livestock are kept in some ways where there's close rearing and crowded conditions, oftentimes with multiple species kept together and in close proximity to humans. And these insights really start to shape how we view hotspots for virus emergence. So when we investigated the species that were most likely to share viruses with people, domesticated species, we found had about 8 times the number of zoonotic viruses than all other species when we looked across the board for all zoonotic viruses. Among wild animals, we found that species that were increasingly abundant. So again, with our ecological footprint, being adaptive and being able to accommodate human incursion and human activities, we found that these species had more viruses as well. In fact, the more rare the wild animal species, the fewer viruses it shared with humans over time. We also, of course, found that bats and primates have shared more viruses with humans as we expected. But our most interesting findings were really with respect to these analyses of different wildlife species and the reasons for why some species have actually declined in abundance. And this work shows that wild animal species in global decline due to habitat loss have actually shared more viruses with people. And we think that's because habitat fragmentation increases disease distribution, and of course, animal-human interactions at these locations. We also found, not surprisingly, that exploitation of wildlife, so wildlife species that have specifically lost global abundance because of poaching, illegal capture, and trade in live wild animal trade, which is of especially high-risk activity, have shared more viruses with people over time. And we know that live animals that are sold in markets where animals and people mix in really crowded conditions is really the perfect epidemiologic setting for viruses to jump between species. Species that would never come together normally in the wild is sort of a natural gain of function experiment, if you will. And so while there are millions of viruses in mammals out there, we know that the species that are most likely to host emerging threats are really just down to a few taxonomic orders. They're the usual suspects. These viruses are going to be found in bats, rodents, primates, of course, because they're so related to us, and mosquitoes. And so this really helps to guide sort of our understanding of how to develop surveillance strategies. And we, of course, can't forget the human dimension. The human dimension of spillover is just as important to understand. So we looked at all the human activities that have resulted in effective contact with wildlife, either through direct or indirect contact, and enabled transmission of viruses. And while a number of viruses were vector-borne, there's quite a number of activities that we will all recognize as being high-risk interfaces or what we call the fault lines for zoonotic spillover, including animals that are around people's dwellings and in agricultural settings, as well as the research and the tourism that we do, but of course, these very close contacts with hunted animals and animals that are put into the trade and in markets, which are fundamentally really important ways for zoonotic spillover. And so when we're thinking a One Health strategy, this data on past spillover events really shapes what we think we need to do to detect and to prevent disease X, so the next pandemic, we of course need a really robust acute febrile surveillance at healthcare facilities and improved diagnostics with laboratory innovations that ideally are brought to the site, to the frontiers where these diseases are most likely to emerge. And then we also need to combine this with longitudinal studies in both people and animals to detect emerging threats, with a focus on people in contact with wild animals and wildlife that are impacted by landscape change, as we've said. And the sampling should be concurrent in time and space across people, wildlife, and vectors, so that we can really understand how these viruses are being transmitted and how they're circulating in communities. And so I think that's really sort of the forward-looking strategy, which also looking back was very much the basis of our cooperative agreement with USAID and many new initiatives, including NIAID's New CREED network. But we really have a very strong capability now because of USAID's investments in developing this collaborative disease surveillance network with leadership around the world, some of who are actually attending this webinar right now, which has established an international disease detection workforce. And the international collegiality and collaboration is fundamental to us having a world that is safer from these zoonotic threats. And this One Health approach to surveillance for viruses with pandemic potential really starts with community leadership and government engagement. So very top down and bottom up at the same time. That is the way that we have learned with our work with USAID, is the only way we can really bring about transformative change. And what we found is that this readiness in between outbreaks is really only established by maintaining that active ongoing surveillance with cohorts and with work that is being done in peacetime, as we like to say. So the global disaster of COVID-19 must be a transformational moment for science and policy, highlighting the need for global cooperation, international cooperation to ensure containment of zoonotic disease outbreaks at the very earliest opportunity, as we have seen in pretty much every country that has faced emergence of COVID-19 on their soil. Early recognition literally saves lives and is worth every penny of investment. Thank you. I'm going to end there.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you very much. You just set the scene very well for me, so I'm going to really talk about some realities of setting up surveillance in the field. My presentation will cover 5 points. First of all, why do we need a different surveillance system for preempting pandemics? It's very obvious that the current systems do not work. What are the existing systems? What are the strengths and weaknesses for dealing with emerging pandemic threats? And what should a new, very different surveillance system look like for detection of early viral spillover events? Some details about the realities of launching such a system and some of the challenges, opportunities, and prospects. And just a couple of lines for conclusions. So we know that all recent pandemics and epidemics have emerged from wildlife to humans or livestock. And as Christine mentioned, there are over 1 million zoonotic viruses that are yet to be discovered. And any of these can emerge anytime, any place, and with unpredictable impacts. We know that also the current global disease tracking and monitoring systems are unreliable and dependent on information from countries and their ability to share timely information. Early disease outbreaks that are reported are actually quite late for a highly infectious viral disease to spread, quite late to respond to for a highly infectious viral disease that can spread very rapidly and transform into a global health emergency and a pandemic. So I think that there is a significant opportunity to expand the existing surveillance systems and networks with new technologies and virus discovery program, as mentioned by Dennis Carroll and Christine. So if you look at the current surveillance systems, you have the national surveillance systems as well as international surveillance systems. And at the national level, the surveillance systems are incredibly heterogeneous and they're highly variable and they're very much dependent on the types of capacities each countries have. But what is important to highlight is that almost all surveillance systems are passive, event-based, and syndromic. Occasionally, some countries linked to the disease control programs also use pathogen-specific surveillance, but these are far and few in between. And if you look at this passive syndromic surveillance, they are highly variable in terms of the data they generate. They're often fragmented and haphazard. Many countries have decentralized surveillance systems, and the information diffusion is very slow to come up at the central level and eventually to the international reporting lines. There are also, and these are political realities that on the ground, there are certain repercussions for certain people who report diseases as well. And one of the most unfortunate things is that despite so much efforts to promote One Health, today surveillance exists as unisectoral, siloed between separately for animal health and public health sectors. Almost all member countries of OIE and WHO also have a legal requirement to report certain diseases. Now, if you look at a typical outbreak curve on the left-hand side, you can see that most of the early reporting would be at an early outbreak stage, if that has been detected early enough. But despite that, such a system does not allow you to really deal with a potentially new virus that rages very rapidly through populations. If you look at the other system, the global systems, there are some very good examples of collaboration, One Health collaboration between WHO, OIE, FAO, the technical agencies who deal with diseases. Recently established, well, not recently, so 2006, the Global Early Warning System. That is a unified system between FAO, OIE, and WHO. The Global Early Warning and Response System essentially gathers information from each individual institutions or organization's source. And then they also scan they have their own separate disease intelligence, as well as they do disease rumor monitoring as well. And this provides a very rich set of outbreak data. And this is an excellent example of a system that is a One Health system. Then there are also viral specific systems. I think the good example is essentially this global influenza surveillance and response system that was established by WHO some 50 years ago. This system then has been further strengthened with a flu network as well as flu ID system. And in the wake of the 2004 avian influenza epizootic, FAO and OIE also established OFFLU, which is essentially a network of animal influenza expertise. And these viral surveillance programs essentially do conduct viral surveillances. They are very well established networks. They provide epidemiological information, and they integrate with genetic data. They have a unified databases, and they have a mechanism for information sharing from country level to regional level, right up to the higher central level, international level. And they've been highly successful in virus selection for seasonal influenza every year. So it's been a very successful viral surveillance program. However, what is missing is that no country has so far attempted multiple viral surveillance programs. And I think that this is what we are now proposing, something that is an opportunity here after COVID-19, and the need for it that is quite obvious at the moment. So what we're looking at is a system which is completely different, not passive, not syndromic, which is not really proactive enough to deal with pandemics. At the same time, the viral surveillance networks that have been established address only single pathogens. So how do we expand this system, and what do we require? What do we need to do to set up such a system? Well, we know that viral spillover events occur all the time from wild animals into livestock and humans. And they are there well before they manifest into a localized outbreak. And therefore, it is a prerequisite to detect these spillover events to preempt pandemics. At the moment, there is no system for active viral surveillance for priority list of viruses in any country. And repeated cycles of new epidemics and pandemics in the last 20 years and their socioeconomic impacts justify new investments. So what could such a viral system and network look like? Dr. Christine actually alluded to this. And if you look at these viral systems that exist at the moment, we have three domains. One on the left-hand side is the virus discovery project, a very significant amount of work and the proof of principle is shown by a USAID-funded program called PREDICT. This is particularly focused on wildlife reservoir, hunting for viruses in the wildlife. Then you got on the right-hand side, which is predominantly passive and syndromic surveillance, which looks at outbreaks. And then what we are proposing is that we should shift this to the left, as Christine mentioned, so that you can have actually a focused, targeted approach at the interface of humans and livestock, particularly on the edges of forests, wildlife trade, farming, livestock markets, and where livestock and the wildlife are consumed. So this provides, if you like, the detection capability where the virus is being circulating in the interface. So how would such a system look like? Well, first of all, if you look at the global net, if you look at the proposal, we are proposing a global network of active longitudinal interface viral surveillance of all zoonotic viruses in humans and livestock. Preferably, such a network and surveillance system should be synchronized and linked with global virome or viral discovery project in wildlife, and it should be synchronous with ongoing classical passive and syndromic surveillance program. And so, where would you carry this out? Well, it is very obvious. The highest risks areas are at the interface. So it has to be risk-based and guided by hotspots. Therefore, it doesn't have to be completely global. It could be country-specific, it could be clusters of countries, or it could be regional. It would be a multi-level partnership, and it would be country-owned, but global in nature. And then what would you look for? I think that initially, you would be looking at priority viral families. These viral families have been already identified, and there are diagnostic tools for this. There are also, WHO has other priority pandemic viruses, and they made a list of this, and this can be included in this surveillance program. And then they will get a high throughput of viruses, a new virus discovery program through the GVP that could be included in this surveillance program. And so there'll be a potential for a big virus watch list that comes out from Global Virome Project that could be included in the surveillance. And then, of course, we have the ability through that program to generate a huge amount of metadata on emerging risks. The question is how you would conduct this in the field. Well, I think there are technological tools that are available that includes the new generation sequencing technologies, metagenomics. There are digital tools for real-time reporting. And then there is ability to look at big data, artificial intelligence modeling and forecasting. And then there is a potential for huge international and regional coordination from existing systems. And of course, there will be a significant need to develop capacity to support this at country level and regional level. And one would expect that such a program would be iterative, flexible, and responding to emerging risks. And overall, I think it should be a One Health-based approach. It should be multi-sectoral, transdisciplinary, looking at both the environmental sector, animal health sectors, and public health sectors. However, there are some quite significant challenges, and I think that it's very important to look at this in considering development of such a program. There are technical challenges like kind of sampling frames that have to be developed, significant need for human resource capacity, for field and laboratory infrastructure, and essentially also looking at how we can build capacity to be able to integrate databases, manage them, and analyze them. There is also a big issue about governance, the policies and regulatory and legislative framework for data sharing, and then decision support tools. If there was a spillover event occur, what are the criteria that one would use to make final decisions about how to eliminate such incursions? And there needs to be developed a protocol for joint risk assessment for spillover events. There is also significant coordination challenges. We need to have buy-in from countries, regional organizations. There is an important role here for tripartite like FAO, OIE, WHO, and support from development partners. But eventually what is required is a shared vision, agreement in principle, and high-level dialogue to be initiated to be able to start thinking about this and launching this program. There are many advantages, of course. You know, we're going to get a huge amount of new information on novel viruses and risks. We'll better understand virus evolution and ecology and begin to understand the evolving risks generated due to ecological factors, socio-economic, political, and behavioral aspects of the risks. An opportunity to create huge unified data sets for sophisticated analysis and forecasting. And eventually an enhanced global ability to detect early spillover events before they become emergencies. I think this is the point that needs to be harped. And then we can build better. COVID-19 shows there is a need to improve our current systems. We have existing systems. These infrastructures, these capacities can be further built on and enhanced and improved. And there is an opportunity to build globally a better capacity in surveillance and in health systems. So particularly a program like this would contribute significantly to health capacity initiatives like IHR, PVS, and GHSA. And finally, to really strengthen all the efforts on One Health by having truly a global partnership among governments, development partners, research institutions, and academia. So to finish off, I'd just like to highlight that COVID-19 has demonstrated there is an urgent need for enhancing existing surveillance systems that detect early spillover events in humans and livestock well before they manifest into a localized outbreak. This is a prerequisite for preempting pandemics. There is a significant opportunity for many organizations, particularly tripartite, to play a leadership role in coordinating and garnering political and financial support. And finally, I think it's important to recognize that this is just not the strategy. We are talking about this as a part of a multi-pronged global effort in supporting preparedness, addressing ecological, socioeconomic, and other drivers of emerging infectious disease, the root causes of EIDs, and also supporting research and development into new therapeutics and vaccines such as viral family vaccines and universal vaccines. However, one of the big challenges would be the significant resources that would be needed. So it's a big transformation. And who would be responsible for financing such a sustainability? So I close here and thank you very much. But just having mentioned about significant resources, I think this is an opportunity for my colleague, Dr. Benjamin Oppenheim, to actually talk about the cost-benefit analysis and financing the surveillance program. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Subhash. And I would just like to echo my gratitude to the organizers at PMAC and my colleagues on this seminar, and to all of you who've joined wherever you are in the world. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm going to share with you a little bit of insight we generated from a recent benefit cost analysis that looked at this question of financing And as Dr. Subhash mentioned, the question of financing is particularly important because we are, as all of you on this line know, locked in repeated cycles of panic and neglect. As Dennis mentioned, all right, COVID is not the first pandemic of the 21st century. It follows several pandemics and a number of major regional epidemics. And after each of these events, there have been warnings about systematic underfinancing of basic aspects of preparedness, of surveillance, of basic research. And this underfinancing is systemic, it is a continual challenge, and it arises from a number of different sources. Of course, there are concerns about the costs necessary to finance surveillance systems and to maintain them over time. There are perceptions that there are real trade-offs to be confronted between preparing for the unknown, for building those surveillance and response systems, and other existing health priorities, including the high disease burdens that continue to exist in many parts of the world. Complicating this picture, pandemics do occur irregularly. It's something of an unfortunate twist of history and timing that COVID-19 occurs roughly 100 years after the 1918 flu. It leads us to make the assumption, sometimes the faulty assumption, that the next pandemic could be decades or possibly 100 years away. And that's simply not the case. All of the research that many of my colleagues on this line have done and that we've done in my organization shows quite clearly that it's always a question of probabilities. And the next pandemic could occur next year, could occur the year after. And the costs of when these events do occur are significant. But because of the irregular occurrence of pandemics, the cost of inaction, of failing to build surveillance and response systems is somewhat obscure. And the benefits of improvements of building the kinds of infrastructure that we're discussing today on this panel have been up until this point relatively difficult to estimate. So together with a series of colleagues briefly depicted here, unfortunately not on the line today, we've conducted some research into this question of the cost benefit from building such a system. And really with the aim of filling two key knowledge gaps. So first, what is the future likely to look like? What are the potential losses from pandemics? What are the losses both in terms of health, in terms of lives lost, infections, and what are the economic losses? And critically, what kind of impact could building a global viral surveillance system have on future pandemic losses? To what extent could that mitigate the health impacts and mitigate the economic impacts? And that latter question really helps us focus on the potential business case that we inevitably need to make to funders, to donors, and to national governments to mobilize resources to build and sustain such a system. What I'll do is speak a bit about the methodology that we've employed here. I won't go too much into detail, and then share some of the top line findings. In terms of how we conducted this analysis, we applied an infectious disease modeling through a framework typically applied to the study of natural catastrophes to generate exceedance probability curves. And these curves basically enable us to answer questions like the italicized text below. So what's the likelihood of a flu pandemic as severe as 1918 next year? What are the odds that we'll see such an event? What's the annualized mortality from filovirus epidemics, from coronavirus pandemics? What is the frequency and severity of epidemics and pandemics? Using this kind of technique, we can generate expected loss estimates, which enable us to at least have some sense of what the future could look like. We generated these loss estimates for a range of key viral usual suspects. So filoviruses, coronaviruses, Nipah, and several others that are certainly high risk in terms of spillover and ignition of epidemics and pandemics. And also the types of viruses that are most likely to be isolated, remediated, stopped in their tracks by the kind of surveillance system that my colleagues have discussed today. And we then generated an alternative view of the future, an alternative exceedance probability curve, estimating the impacts of a global viral surveillance system under a range of different assumptions to model, to estimate, and to give us some intuitions about the kinds of impacts that it could generate in terms of averting those human losses, that loss of life and economic losses. Just briefly on the modeling approach, this will be familiar to many folks on the line a modified SEIR model operating on a global scale, simulating that initial spillover event, that spark that ignites an epidemic, the movement of people spreading the disease through commuting and global travel, preparedness and policy responses. And we do this hundreds of thousands of times to generate a collection of scientifically plausible hypothetical events that we build into a catalog at very large scale. And from this, we can then estimate, by modifying this approach, we can estimate the potential impacts of a global surveillance system. And we focused on two key mechanisms of impact. So one, as my colleagues have discussed, building this kind of system could create significant improvements to outbreak detection and response through capacity building, through the kind of investments in infrastructure and training that we've seen through programs like PREDICT. So building up laboratory and diagnostic capacity to identify that index case earlier, to characterize it, and to help stand up a response. And secondly, and significantly, to reduce spillover precisely through the kind of hotspot mapping that Dr. Johnson discussed just a few minutes ago, to identify where the high-risk viruses are resident, the kind of host-human interaction dynamics, and to use this information to inform both the design and the targeting of behavioral risk reduction programs, as well as regulation, to try to prevent spillover events, to contain. So we estimate a range of different effect sizes in terms of both of these mechanisms to give us a sense of what this kind of surveillance system could do, and then estimate the benefits. We compare our kind of baseline view of the future with this impacted exceedance probability curve to estimate the number of lives we can save and to estimate the economic losses that we can avert. And when I say economic losses, I'm really thinking of two different types and mechanisms, and they're both important to discuss. One is the loss to national income. As we've seen through COVID-19, epidemics and pandemics are enormously destructive in terms of their effect on national economies. It's not just about lockdowns. Lockdowns are significant, but also fear and behavioral change, which can be incredibly persistent, leading people to shift their patterns of work and consumption and investment, according to some estimates, many years into the future. So epidemics and pandemics can have an enormous economic drag effect, which we have to confront, take into account, and ultimately contain. And then each of the lives that are lost during an epidemic or pandemic has an intrinsic value. And it's important to incorporate this as well. And so we estimate both in order to generate a view of the true burden of epidemics and pandemics, and a true understanding, or a more accurate understanding of the benefits of averting them. And so here are some top line findings. The chart on the right shows the expected annual loss from a number of key usual suspects, viral usual suspects, in terms of deaths and also in terms of economic losses. And I'll just highlight a couple of findings. So one is that the annualized losses from epidemics are, of course, quite significant. We estimate that just among these viral classes, something like 40,000 potentially preventable deaths per year. Many of these arise from filovirus epidemics, which are more frequent, but of course coronaviruses, as this event shows, can be enormously fatal, and particularly at large scale. And the economic losses are significant. We estimate 53 billion in annualized economic losses, much of that driven by losses to national income, that shock to national economies that all of us are living through now. But significant losses as well in terms of the intrinsic value of lives lost. And that intrinsic value grows increasingly large, of course, for very large events. It's important to note that in many years, of course, there will be no epidemic, no pandemic. These events are irregular, and the losses are driven by rare, unusual events far out in the probability curve, like COVID, which are infrequent, difficult to draw our attention to, but extremely large in terms of their impact upon societies. I should note too that the estimates I'm showing here are just from a couple of the usual suspects, a couple of critical usual suspects. They don't include the impacts of novel influenza, which are critical, have been well studied, and are an order of magnitude larger. So this is only one slice of the potential losses from future epidemics and pandemics. what we've learned from this analysis is that building a global viral surveillance system, a network, could yield extremely large and consequential reductions in risk. And I want to highlight in particular the effect of reducing the rate of viral spillover. What we found is that a roughly 1% reduction in the spillover rate would yield about $500 million in annualized losses averted. And that effect scales linearly. So for every percent we can chop off, we save a significant amount of economic resources, much of that by averting losses to national income. And what this suggests is a really foundational, critical, vital role for identifying hotspots and really targeting them with very tailored prevention efforts. So this underlines the centrality of prevention in all of the efforts that we undertake. That is, however, not to neglect the importance of early detection, identification, and reporting. So mitigation once that spillover event occurs and a chain of infections through humans has happened. That effect is somewhat smaller, but still enormously significant economically. We estimate, for example, that reducing detection time by just a couple of weeks on average could avert something like $150 million in annualized losses. This effect doesn't quite scale linearly, but it's still quite significant. So every quantum of time we can shave off in terms of identification, detection, reporting, response yields very significant savings. What we've learned in summary is that without action, future losses from epidemics will be significant. So those annualized losses I've shown of $50 billion are roughly in line with other estimates from the US National Academies. They're large. As I mentioned, they're only one slice of future epidemic threats, and they don't include other loss drivers like pandemic flu and like the unknown unknowns, which viral discovery programs can shed light on and help us to better understand. So take these as a kind of baseline estimate that gives us an understanding of the risk, but only a partial understanding of the risk. What we've learned as well is that even relatively small improvements can yield extremely large impacts economically. So those investments in basic science and in surveillance, applied surveillance, can help to avert very large losses to national income. And in many cases, as we talk about financing, we're looking at what appear to us in the health sector to be relatively large investments to build and sustain and maintain surveillance systems. Those costs are small relative to the potential health and economic benefits, which is to say that there is a business case for making these kinds of investments in addition to a clear ethical and public health rationale. And it's important as we undertake dialogue with donors, with ministries of finance, with all of the players that have to allocate resources, scarce resources among different causes, to make the case for this kind of work. Lastly, what I would highlight are a couple of implications for program design. As I've mentioned, we find through our analysis particularly significant benefits for prevention and risk reduction activities. Again, as I noted, spillover risk is concentrated in hotspots, and of course the prevention work would take place in those hotspots to identify and target them with risk reduction activities. So that implies that the program could be, as Dr. Subhash mentions, concentrated, should be. Our attention should be concentrated. That said, this program is most impactful, or this kind of work is most impactful if it's global in scope, global in scale, because a significant stream of the benefits that we do find come from improving detection and response time, which ultimately is dependent upon national capacity building, which needs to be global in scale. So the message I would leave you with is that no country should be left behind in this kind of effort. It's important that they be linked. And with this, I will thank you for your kind attention and stop and return the microphone to my colleagues.
Thank you, Benjamin. Excellent presentation. I would like to invite all the panelists to turn their videos on. So we're going to have a question and answer session now. And I have got a few questions already on the question and answer box that I will raise so that you have an opportunity to ask questions. I would invite also the audience to put in some more questions if they have. And I think that we want to make this as interactive as possible. And given the fact that, people are only presenting for a very short period of time, there is an opportunity to expand on certain points that you might have not had time to actually articulate fully. So I have a few questions at the moment. There is a question from an audience that is asking. Let me just actually read the question. The virus surveillance network in a particular country fall under different domains of administration, as for example, Ministry of Health, of Ministry of Agriculture, etc., where there is no One Health established approaches. And therefore, rolling out such an ambitious program is quite challenging. And what would you suggest under such circumstances to enable the kind of proposed surveillance? So that's the question. And I think that I will pass it on to Christine first, and then if I have an opportunity, I will add some as well. So Christine, you've been talking about surveillance. You've been involved in sort of PREDICT program for conducting surveillance. So you have faced some field challenges and you have overcome many of these things. So I think that your experience would be extremely useful. Over to you, Christine.
Thank you, Subhash. I would suggest that you would actually know very well how to answer this, but I'll make a go. Yeah, I think really fundamentally with USAID's leadership, we partnered with country governments where we were fortunate enough to be able to operate PREDICT. And we did that in collaboration across all ministries. And that was very much a fundamental part of the design. We knew that we needed to sort of share findings and get going with respect to the Ministry of Health, of course, the Ministry of Livestock and the Ministry of Environment. And all that was very fundamental to the One Health approach. And I think one thing that PREDICT did do in some countries, the integration of ministries was leading the way. I would say leading the way globally in many of the countries where we were fortunate to learn from them how to operationalize One Health across the ministries. They had a very functional, whether it was a One Health task force or One Health network, that was very nimbly able to work with not only our participation, but also with outbreaks that moved between these sectors like we're describing. And most of those One Health task forces were established in response to these exact kind of diseases that we're talking about. And those countries are much better for it. And I think they've done phenomenally better under the COVID-19 pandemic than other countries where we don't have that. US, we've called for a One Health task force that would be interagency, that would be similar, that would actually massively benefit from integration across, the animal and human health sector, but also the environment, which is phenomenally left behind in the United States. I can speak for certainly, but in many places as well. Anyway, over to you and my colleagues to add more insight.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you. I just add a couple of points. I think that there has been a fantastic progress in promoting One Health ever since the avian influenza outbreak that emerged in 2004. And I think that a number of donor agencies, particularly USAID, has supported huge amount of funding and efforts to establish One Health networks regionally in Africa and in Asia. So I think there has been a fantastic progress, and I can see that there are many regional networks. There are many, many countries who have their One Health workforce and task forces. But I think there is also an opportunity to do a little bit more in this area. And I think that at the moment, the sort of global efforts, the fact that WHO, FAO, IER have a tripartite collaboration in itself is trying to demonstrate we can walk the talk of One Health talk as well. And then at the same time, I think that it's very important that there are initiatives like Global Health Security Agenda that is essentially trying to build a One Health task force for addressing these kind of emergencies as well. So I think there is progress, and I think the question is extremely relevant that, without a One Health approach, such a surveillance system, we're looking at 3 different sectors, cannot be easily set up. I think there are others who might want to add something. Dennis and Ben, do you have anything to add?
Well, let me first off say that, moving towards a multi-sectoral approach is not, we've found over the years, not natural. It's been really challenging over the course of the last 15 years. As you mentioned, the emergence of avian influenza really sparked sort of the understanding that we needed to have a One Health approach. It's proven to be very challenging, but it's worth noting that there are a handful of countries that have really shown the way. I think, in particular, the host of this meeting, the government of Thailand, is an example of really forward-leaning leadership from the government to bring the different ministries together towards meeting the challenges of One Health. Similarly, the government of Uganda has really embraced this approach, and we've seen it play itself out quite remarkably as it's grown increasingly more capable in responding to events like Ebola and Marburg. But we have a long ways to go. It's not an easy task. And in many ways, it's a case of social re-engineering. We need governments and we need societies to rethink what the relationships are. We tend to be very stovepipe, both, not just within our ministries, but within our professional realms. And we need to challenge ourselves to really think beyond the normal hierarchical way that we've thought about problems and we've thought about solutions. So it's an excellent question. And in many ways, it's probably the most challenging task ahead of us. Not so much the financing, that's a challenge, but the re-engineering of how ministries and professional groups work together, understand problems and coordinate responses is going to be one of the biggest challenges we have. So an important way forward, but not an easy way forward. You're on mute.
Yes, I just unmuted myself. Thank you very much. There is a question from an old colleague of mine, and there's a comment and asking for response. He's asking that along with surveillance and monitoring, poverty alleviation is paramount to reducing risk of emerging infectious diseases. And poverty is often a driver of human encroachment on forests, harvesting of wild meat, and lack of mitigating behaviors. So are there any comments? So David, I can just take up just a very quick comment and then I'll ask the panel to say a few words. But of course, I fully agree that, when we are proposing a surveillance program like this, we cannot ignore the sort of fundamental and the root causes of disease emergence and spread, particularly pandemics. And in this regard, I think that apart from the ecological drivers and the trade, the globalization, there is a significant risk associated with poverty. It's not only poverty, there are also sort of protracted crises in many regions of the world where there is a significant risk of disease spillover and threats. In addition to that, of course, there are other economic drivers as well as political and behavioral drivers and cultural practices. So I think there is it's a multi-dimensional problem. And I think that we are not going to be able to solve this problem by having just a one focused discipline, but a multidisciplinary approach that is embodied within the One Health. So I'll just stop here and perhaps ask our panel members to expand on this. Thank you. So perhaps, can I ask Ben for a start, because Ben has been a bit quiet for a while, so he can come in and say a few words for this question.
I've just been vigorously agreeing. No, I think it's a very important issue to raise that poverty and disease emergence are linked. Certainly there's plenty of evidence to underline this point. And poverty is a driver. It's also an amplifier of many of the other trends that my fellow panelists have discussed today. I would just say that in you need the right kind of poverty alleviation and the right kind of growth in order to reduce this risk. Of course, there are many economic kind of growth practices and models that tend to be environmentally destructive, that would tend to amplify other drivers of disease emergence. And so in hotspot areas that are also impoverished areas, there needs to be environmentally sensitive growth with an eye towards sustainability. And it's a challenge, but there are plenty of very promising experiments underway all around the world that point to the way forward.
Poverty is, of course, is a global agenda, sustainable development goal of universally accepted SDGs. So it's very important. So, Dennis, do you have anything to add on this one?
No, I think the point that Ben made, which is that there are really solid evidence that shows that the behaviors and practices that really enable and trigger spillover are very closely associated with sort of social economic, where you sit within social economic quintiles. And we need to better understand those behaviors and practices within the economic context of where people are living. So it's a matter of not just promoting right practices, it's also about enabling right practices and creating economic opportunities for people to have alternatives to some of the practices that we're engaged in. Subhash, you know that one of the big drivers behind the spread of avian influenza has been the mom and pop, if you will, production of poultry. And those poultry acted as an enormously important economic source for those families. But they also were done in ways that were very low biosecurity. It enabled the introduction and spread and ultimately the amplification of these viruses. It was bringing this under control really had to create alternative livelihoods or elevate the livelihood opportunities for these communities to be able to solve not only their own economic problems, but to deal with the threats posed by avian influenza. So they're tremendously interconnected, and it's very much the challenge needs to focus on how do we address the high-risk practices and behaviors, and they're very closely associated with high-risk groupings, and those groupings are disproportionately linked to, again, where you sit within economic quintiles. You're on mute again.
Keep on forgetting this. There is a specific question for Benjamin here. A colleague of mine is asking, cost of virus surveillance is very high, but the high risk area is in low income countries with government may not have enough budget to conduct surveillance. How to balance between high risks and low budget? Benjamin.
It's an important and challenging question. I suspect everyone on the panel will have thoughts about this point. So I'll just say a few words and then turn it over to the group. The cost is significant. Of course, the benefits we found are extraordinarily significant as well, and the cost benefit ratio is positive. So part of the implication of our findings is that donors should view this kind of investment essentially as a favorable one to make. Right there, every incremental dollar that we invest in surveillance, in risk reduction, and prevention, that's a dollar that has an enormously significant stream of benefits attached to it in terms of averting economic losses. And so part of the answer absolutely has to be additional resources from high-income countries, high-income regions, to invest in surveillance in high-risk, low-income regions. That's going to be fundamentally necessary. We can't ask poor countries and poor regions to shoulder the burden of this kind of work when it's a global problem. Yeah. And it's of course a difficult argument to make in this moment, given that a lot of donors, a lot of countries around the world are suffering economically because of COVID. But that's precisely the point we have to make, that the losses are global in scale. And if we want to avert this kind of event in the future, we have to make these kinds of investments. And as Christine said, it's pennies on the dollar. These are extraordinarily small amounts of money when compared against the magnitude of the losses we're seeing now. So I know that's not a complete answer because we have a case to make, but I think we can make that case persuasively.
I think the additional point, Benjamin, is that if you look at the previous epidemics and the pandemics, they've had a very high impact in the global south and very transient impacts in the first world, if you like. And COVID-19 has shown, it's completely the opposite. The head is turned round, if you like. And I think that everybody now recognizes that it is an international public good and everybody has to contribute. And I think it has to be proportional as well. So it's an important, extremely important point that it is a global responsibility as well. If I can move on, there is another related question, and that is about costs of pandemics. Global estimates of economic costs and losses associated with pandemic preparedness have been available since late 2000, put together by World Bank, FAO, WHO, and others. What can be learned from the successes and roadblocks since then about how to succeed in generating and using economic estimates to achieve sustainable and reliable investments in One Health activities, including better surveillance activities? That's up your stream, Benjamin.
I'll share a few thoughts. So it's true. There have been important efforts at generating these kind of estimates over time, and yet we still face this cycle of panic and neglect with systematic underfinancing of global public goods. Part of the answer, I think, unfortunately, lies in the experience of COVID itself. That this is such a visceral experience for so many people around the world who control access to resources and are forced to confront. Subhash, as you'd indicated, the reality that this is a global problem experienced by all. So I think our case will be somewhat easier to make in the future. But I guess on a more technical point, a lot of the estimates have been very disease specific. So a lot of focus on the significant economic risk and economic losses from pandemic influenza. That's entirely appropriate, but we have to broaden our optic. And part of what we learned from our effort is that, of course, these other high-risk viruses that are really concentrated in the hotspots that we've all discussed today represent very significant economic threats as well. And I think the broader the optic we take in terms of the variety of viral threats, the variety of economic impacts that they can generate, the more persuasive we can be. I think as well, there will need to be some sustained attention to generating forward-looking economic estimates. So it can't be the case that we do this kind of analysis every 5 years, every 10 years. We need continued attention to the potential risks and threats, and as well to the kind of marginal improvements that we're making. So we need better ways to estimate and communicate to policymakers the kinds of impacts of risk reduction activities and what those are yielding for us in terms of economic benefits incrementally over time, to show where we're making progress, identify where we're not, and communicate consistently and over time the need for additional resources. So it's got to be a sustained campaign of scientific work and scientific communication.
No, good. And I think that there is a related question. This is regard to your methodology, that there is the whole process is very stochastic, the pandemic process. And the question here is that 1% reduction in spillover of any given virus threat, the kind of stochastic processes that occur is very uncertain. Could Ben comment further on how this uncertainty was taken into account when you were preparing your analysis?
Oh, that's a good question. So I'm going to suggest
You can
whoever
just,
the...
yeah.
Yeah, we should please get in touch. My email is on the slide. I would love to discuss. Just to say that we did, the models are stochastic. It's extraordinarily important to take this into account, both in terms of the viral emergence and spillover in the model, as well as the economic impacts. So, so I found the important point. Agree. Let's discuss by email, please.
There is, thank you. There is also a question very specific for Dennis Carroll, and that came through my private email message. They want to know, Dennis, from you, this very exciting global viral discovery program. What are the sort of timelines for that? And again, related to what Benjamin is saying, there are opportunities for funding and mounting a true global viral genome program, discovery program. Dennis.
Well, thank you for the question. Look, the Global Virome Project, if you paid close attention to Subhash's presentation, the Global Virome Project is an initial down payment on what we would propose for this larger global viral surveillance network. And the work that we're proposing to do under the Global Virome Project is over a 10-year period, create sort of the global atlas that documents the high-risk viruses, what their animal host range is, their geographic distribution, and further granularize our understanding of hotspots. That enables then this longer-term surveillance system to really bring strategic focus on specific viruses among specific animal hosts within specific geographic areas, and focusing on those behaviors and practices that allow us to prevent, detect, and respond more quickly. The Global Virome Project, clearly the events of the COVID-19 sort of remind us that we can't keep doing the same thing over and over again. We do have to think differently and act differently. And GVP is really about coalescing the kind of partnership, global in nature, that enables us to begin to develop the kind of forward-leaning capability, go to the viruses before they come to us. So we're encouraged by a lot of the feedback that we're getting. We're looking, obviously, COVID-19 is a disruptive period in terms of our being able to go forward. But we look as we, over the course of the upcoming year, to begin launching in a series of countries to begin laying the foundation for the operational features of the Global Virome Project. I would encourage you to go to our website, globalviromeproject.org. And if you have questions, do not hesitate to reach out. We very much would welcome expanding the dialogue and increasing people's awareness and ultimate value. But it's a step one in the way forward towards building this global network for making the world safe and making sure we never have another COVID-19 event again.
Thank you, Dennis, very much for this very clear timeline. Christine, do you want to add anything to this one?
No, I mean, I'm just seeing all the additional questions and all that we probably won't have time to get to, but I completely agree that this is hard work. We need to start somewhere, and it's going to take a really global coalition. I think I would just end echoing what you said, Subhash, is that this is something that is in the global public good. And I'm really excited to see all of the One Health strategizing and bringing in the environment that was mentioned by several in the chat as well, and how important that is going to be in ensuring future preparedness as well. So thank you.
Yeah, they're just, I think that we are almost coming to an end of the session, but there are just two very quick questions, and perhaps we can address them very quickly. One was about what about non-traditional surveillance systems, Christine? So things like ProMed and health maps, and how useful are they? in supporting the global surveillance program. And Christine, you can perhaps respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, just very quickly, that was fundamentally useful in getting the word out. These are tools for communication. I think we absolutely still need the underlying investment and structure to do the detection and to support those scientists along the lines of what we've all been describing. But ProMed and HealthMap have been really game changers in transparency and getting the word out. And I'm hopeful that there's similar technologies on the rise that can make a lot of this work cheaper and more efficient going forward.
Yeah. And I think perhaps we'll take the last one. There is a comment here that, we're talking about tripartite, we're talking about international cross-sectoral collaboration, but really there is a very important UN agency, United Nations Environment Program. Their headquarters are based in Nairobi. They are an important group of people, and I think that there is significant opportunity if you want to strengthen One Health to also embrace UNEP as a part of a tripartite to make it a bigger quadripite or something like that, so that it's really important. But I think that's a very good comment and very much appreciated that this comment was made. And I think that an organization like International Livestock Research Institute recently established a very strong partnership with UNEP in the context of addressing pandemics, zoonosis, and foodborne diseases as well. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank everybody, the panel members, for really, particularly those from California, waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning and be awake and looking so wide awake. It's absolutely fantastic, brilliant presentation. Dennis, for your leadership. And I think I'd like to really thank PMAC Secretariat for really running this very, very efficiently. As usual, they always do a fantastic job, so it's highly, highly appreciated. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, my job as a moderator is finished here. And I take this opportunity to thank you all very much. Have a great day, have a great evening, and have a great night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.